Well, good evening to you all, you faithful folks who are coming out tonight. You are here on time, so I'm going to start on time. I left my cell phone at home, and usually I check what time I am by, looking at the phone. I don't wear a watch, so I brought the phone from my office. So that should make sure that we get in and out of here about in the time frame. So we'll be done between 8:15 and 8:30. It is about how long I think things will go. And we kept right to that time this morning. So today we're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to talk about Dorothy Day and about liturgy and justice. And this morning we celebrated the 100th anniversary Mass for Mother Cabrini. And so it's a good day to introduce you to another great woman of the church. We were just talking beforehand. And Dorothy Day is on the path to sainthood, and they announced this about 5 years ago on the feast of Mother Cabrini. So it's quite appropriate that we are talking about her works today. But we're actually going to be talking about three different pieces. I wanted to paint a very broad picture about Catholic social teaching and looking at it from a historical perspective, because that will help us understand what we're talking about. And then we're going to walk through Dorothy Day's life, because so much of her life is the journey that got her to where she really began her ministry. So helping you explore that a little bit will give you a sense of her. And the thing I love is her journey was much like yours and mine. It was full of mistakes and pitfalls and rough things along the way. And she was kind of a crusty lady. Not always anything sweet or complacent about her. She could talk with the best of the sailors, and her life was filled, like I say, with bumps and sins along the way. But when she had her conversion experience, in the moments of it, she embraced it totally with her life. So we're going to try and get a sense of that whole picture. And then there are some other elements that when we look at her story, you could say, oh, that's just a liberal agenda or something like that. But I thought it was really important to point out that what we're following is over 100 years of Catholic Church teachings as well on social issues. So we're going to give you a broad sense of those. I'm not going to read through every document and quote them all to you, or we'll be here till next year, so I won't do that, but we'll get a sense of those. And I was working on the talk and putting it all together, and I was going to start out talking about Dorothy, but once I had all my facts in place, it felt like it would just be a little better to switch around and kind of give you the background on the social teachings first. So we'll start with that. We'll do the heavy while you're wide awake, and we'll get to the Dorothy stuff, which is kind of fun, a little later, so it'll be like a breather for us. And I hope that works well that way. And finally, we're going to tie it all together with how this all works in our daily practice and in our daily lives and in our liturgies. So that's the idea for the night. The concept of the poor is as old as time. In the Jewish scriptures, they were called the anawim, the poor. And there was always a special sense of caring for the orphan and the widow and the stranger, or the aliens or the foreigners as they were called. Basically those marginalized in any way. So this is not a new idea. This morning for Mass we used Isaiah 58 for the opening reading. This is not the fast I choose, releasing those bound unjustly, but to feed the hungry, to give to the poor. Then your bread share your bread with your hungry, clothing the naked. Then your light will break like the dawn, and your wound will be quickly healed. This is the idea that was found in Isaiah, very prevalent. And if you get nothing out of today at all, well, I hope you get something, but the biggest nutshell to walk away with is Matthew 25. Matthew 25, we have the vision of the Lord and the sheep and the goats. Lord, when did I see you hungry? When did I see you naked? When you take care of the least of these, you saw me. That final judgment, that is what all social teaching is based upon, really. That's the basis of our corporal and spiritual works of mercy. That's the basis that Dorothy Day goes back to time and time again. And that's the basis that Christ taught us. That and the Beatitudes were probably the two most important scriptures. So the idea of the poor is nothing new. But sometimes there were also many others who worked with the poor along the way. I don't expect you to be able to read that from there. It is on your handouts. Just looking roughly at some of the people. St. Patrick, besides being famous for snakes in Ireland, he also did great things to help the slave people that were undermined. St. Francis of Assisi, we know he didn't live in a monastery like most other monks. He was what was called a mendicant. He was out and about, living very poorly, basically begging for his food, going from place to place, helping those in need. Aquinas used his intellect more, but he also pled for the simplicity of life and the need for the poor. Catherine of Siena was active during the time of the plague, Black Plague, and so she was a noblewoman by birth, but she went out and was helping to nurse the sick, care for others. St. Louise de Marillac and Vincent de Paul, French saints that, St. Vinny's, we all know the fine ministries that are still being done in their name today. But together they founded houses to care for the poor and did much great work. And I think you're familiar with the work of St. Frances Cabrini in Chicago and in places all over the country as she worked to care for the poor. And then tonight we're going to tell you more about Dorothy Day. Daniel Berrigan is another modern person who worked with that. He just passed away last year. And St. Teresa of Calcutta, who worked with the poorest of the poor. That's just 9 or 10 examples. I could give you a list of 1,000 people, but I won't do that because I want to talk about other things tonight. So sometimes the concept of Catholic social teaching is considered the Church's best kept secret because there have been writings, papal writings, and teachings from the Church, but that's not what we hear from the pulpit a lot, or sometimes that's not what we've heard in years past. Much that came out was about church morality and keeping rules and being free from sin and all those type of things, clear conscience, everything else. That's very important. But the other pieces of social teaching kind of got lost in that shuffle a little bit, even though they were mentioned in the Gospel, in the Old Testament, in places. So that was not always seen. What I'd like to do, though, is get you in touch with the basic principles of social teaching as we name them now. In the last 100 or so years, there's been a lot of work to bring them to the forefront. It's naming things that we know and that should be in place, but they just finally got names and they made a nice list of them, basically. So it's a good summary. And these are nothing to be taken for granted. They are something that was not in place 100 years ago at all. The first of them is the concept of life and dignity of the human person. The concept that all of human life has dignity, and that abortion, euthanasia, cloning and testing on fetuses, all these things are wrong. We keep fighting that battle, and society has gotten even further out as, abortions are commonplace, and so that the need to respect life and dignity of the human person in all forms continues to be a very high priority and a need today. Second one mentioned is the call to family, community, and participation. We live in a culture which has excessive individualism, and the person needs to be both sacred and social. That means we're not meant to live in isolation. We need to be in communion with others. We grow in community. Look at how many times you go out to a restaurant now, or you see families get together and everybody's sitting on their cell phone instead of in communion with each other. Or we just even can't live in isolation in other ways. And in that same sense, the government is to protect lives and dignity and to promote the common good. Now that's something you're going to hear over and over tonight, promoting the common good. There are basic human rights that we all should have. The right to life, the right to personal and social responsibilities. John, in 1979, as John Paul spoke to the United Nations, he put together a whole list of inalienable rights that we have: rights to work, right to speech, right to labor, to unions, right to health, all these things. Again, not in a handout society, but these are just common basic needs that people should have access to. And in the Vatican II documents, they also spoke very highly of these. In Pachamentarum, there was a whole list of the rights. It's a page long, so I'm not going to spell them all out for you, but the idea is there that nobody should be walked on. And always, there should be an option for the poor and for the vulnerable. This isn't talking about handouts. This is talking about always kind of asking a moral test. How are we as a society doing when we ask how are our vulnerable doing? How are we taking care of those who have special needs, or who are handicapped, or who are the poor? That's always kind of a test of where we're at. It's kind of a moral litmus in some sense. Then we have the concept of dignity. The dignity of work and the rights of workers. The economy serves the people, and so they're the basic rights: respected wages, the unions, private property, and the economic initiative. And lastly, and two more, the idea of solidarity, which means caring for the human family, loving our neighbor, again thinking of that common good. And the last point is caring for God's earth, being stewards of the earth in our relationship. When you look at the two creation accounts in Genesis, they have two different stories. Actually, Father just preached on this the other week. In the first Genesis account, God made humanity and it was good. It was about God the Creator. In the second account, it talked about what God had Adam do in caring for the earth. God addressed Adam as steward, so it took in that role of caring for God's creation. Okay, another way of looking at that, boiling it down from that 9, another document knocks it down to just 4 things. Dignity of the human person, the common good, which means the conditions allow people and groups to reach fulfillment, the rights to property and preferential option for the poor. 3, subsidiarity, that's to help or to serve, that the higher bodies act on behalf of the lower. But the fascinating thing about that is it's always at the most local level. You know, what can you as a family do for your family? What can you do as a parish do for your parish community? What can we as West Bend folks do for the broader community? It starts at the most basic level and then goes upwards. It's not supposed to be something like a government handout that comes down or something like that we're talking about. And I'm in no way getting into any political arguments tonight with anybody on right, left, middle, sideways. I'm just kind of giving you the sense of the church teachings on these things, so I hope you understand that. John Paul II said, "It is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good, that is to say, to the good of all and of each individual, because we are responsible for all. We have the 4 fundamental values of truth, freedom, love, and justice." There's a document on the Compendium of Social Doctrine. It says, social Catholicism, you can read it right there, but I think it's important enough I'm going to read it aloud. It's at the crossroads where Christian life and our conscience come into contact with the real world. So how we are active Catholics, this is a point where the road meets the rubber, where our laws, our actions, our teaching meet what we do and how we live it out daily. And that's a challenging place, and you can hit or miss or make that connection wherever, a number of different places. But I think it's a very important concept, and I love just that image of the crossroads where the Christian life and conscience come into contact with the real world. And the teachings point out, basically we have 3 levels of doing this. They call them spheres of discipleship. The first level being carrying out the basic works of mercy, the works of justice, the corporal works of mercy. And if you don't remember those from your catechism days, I have them listed on I think the very back page of the document. But it's our fundamental social responsibility. And so we're involved in a number of different ways. And everybody a little bit differently. In our volunteerism, sometimes in our time and our money, sometimes in our personal prayer. It's true, we can't do everything. How many things do you get in the mail a week or something asking for a handout financially, or how many committees want your help? No one person can do it all. But at that fundamental level, we're all involved in something. In 1 Corinthians, it says, "Love is more than activity. If I give away all I have and deliver my body to be burned, but do not have love, I gain nothing." Or Mother Teresa says, "Love, to be true, must first be for our neighbor. This will bring us to God. We must see Jesus in everyone. In that person-to-person contact is where we find Christ." So that's that very basic sphere. You know, and I think sometimes we don't even see ways that we can help each other on that simple level, saying, oh, I don't have time with my kids, or there's nothing in my checkbook left, or whatever the situation may be. It was interesting, I was home this afternoon, and I got a call from a friend of mine. Her daughter is having some troubles with the court system, with some custody, and doesn't have the money for a lawyer, and doesn't have the money for some things. And my friend asked me will you listen to my daughter and hear what she has to say, and then craft it in a letter that she can at least send to the judge, because this girl didn't have the writing skills or the language skills. And that's something that I could take for granted almost, but it's an easy gift to give. There's another thing I've done, is help a number of people who are starting over in life, coming out of prison, coming out of other things, coming out of recovery, helping them do a basic resume. And it's a skill that's pretty easy for me, and I never thought, that was a way I could be a volunteer, a steward at that most basic level of discipleship. So I just say that in encouraging you to broaden your own thoughts of what you might have to offer, what gifts you might be able to give in that sense. The second level that is talked about is public expression, personal commitment. This is when you might be at a level where you boycott and write letters or serve in organizations for schools, and you look for social and institutional change. Some people may be called to that level of activity. And the third vocation in the sphere of discipleship is to social analysis for social change. We're talking about action, personal and public social involvement. So a really good example of that is what we do with our high school kids in the mission trips. The first stage, they experience the immersion in the ministry and in the situation. Then when they do that, they have some follow-up. They do a social analysis. They learn the political conditions, or they see, judge, and act. Then they learn how it's grounded in social tradition. And then again, there's some more deliberation and dialogue about the whole thing. But that's a perfect example we see every year happening all the time. And there are hundreds like that, but that's just a great one to where we teach that analysis for social change to those high schooler kids all the time. And I bet you could think of many other experiences. Now, the big person that really started change in the church was Leo XIII. This was during the time of the Industrial Revolution, and much of poverty was happening because of changes in social interaction. When people were living on the farms, they may not have had much, but they had food to eat, and they could get by a little bit, and you had all the kids to help you with the chores and everything else, and life was not simple, and it was not easy, but it wasn't the deplorable poverty, or it wasn't, in living in the slums, it wasn't the conditions in the factories or anything like that. That's what happened with the Industrial Revolution. We also had capitalism coming in, just hungry greed taking over. And with that, all of that, there began to be some social and moral conditions that began to weaken, and people's morals just plain decayed. So what Leo said in his document about New Things, that we have to care for all of that. We have to look at private property, at the rights of children, at all these human conditions, everything else. But he didn't just say, you, go clean that up. He said, everybody's got a job to do. He said, All people, no matter how rich or how poor, share equally the capacity for virtue, and such virtue will be rewarded with everlasting happiness. But he saw that, okay, workers, it's your job to do this, to do your job, to do it joyfully, to be there on time, to work hard. Shop owners, it's your job to take care of your people, give them lunch breaks, give them things. Manufacturers, have the equipment they need. Church, how are you caring for your community with charity? Government, what's your social responsibility? So that's basically what that whole document does, is break down everyone's role in a nutshell. And it sets the stage for all those other points I made earlier, but it's the foundation. But he ends it by saying, only religion can restore evil. He saw what was happening to the society as more and more evil. Now, I'm not going to take you through every document there was on the social teachings. That's how much I like you. Basically, you can look at the divisions and the history of Catholic social teaching, and you can say pre-Vatican, post-Vatican, there was a big shift in ideas there, but there are all some very other clear points, and social teaching and the needs have changed a lot in the last century. So we talked about the plight of the working class. In 1941, we've got World War II, the need for a just and peaceful international order coming forth. And notice that's also on the 50th anniversary of the first Catholic teaching. Often encyclicals and documents are written on the anniversary of some important date before, so it's calling respect to that previous document. In 1965, the very first document to come out of Vatican II was Gaudium et Spes, which talked about the role of the church in social life. And another Pacem in Terram, building our just social economic order. In 81 with John Paul, talking about the meaning of economic life in relation to socialism, capitalism, and globalization. As we become more an international society, that globalization is huge. Benedict, we dealt with some charity, the green issues, and just distribution of goods. Excuse me. Getting so excited, I'm getting ahead of myself. With Francis, again, some of the global issues, the migration issues, talking about water issues, and the Latin American influence. These are only the nutshell pieces. There are so many documents and so many things that have been written, and on many different levels. We have like the papal encyclicals, we're at the highest level. We have documents by the United States bishops, which is a medium level, and we have things written, papal documents written as letters, which are another level of authority, as it's called. But these things continue to be addressed over and over again. And I believe very near your back page, right before you get into the corporal works of mercy, I've included a link that has a list of all the social teaching, or almost all the social, it's an exhaustive list of social teaching documents, and you can click on that and actually read the text of any of the documents that you're interested in. And this book was wonderful, Essential Catholic Social Thought. I read many different pieces in preparation for this, but I really appreciated the way this one spelled things out. And it has a lot of the actual documents right in it as well. So I gave you a little bit of our Pope Leo's talk on social justice. So let's look at the last thing. Pope Francis in his encyclical Laudato Si. In the present state of global society, where injustices abound and growing numbers of people are deprived of basic human rights and considered expendable, the principle of the common good immediately becomes, logically and inevitably, a summons to solidarity and a preferential option for the poorest of our brothers and sisters. This option entails recognizing the implication of the universal destination of the world's good. It demands, before all else, on appreciation of the dignity of the poor in the light of our deepest convictions as believers. So again, the basic human rights, the common good, the dignity of the poor come out again. And it struck me as I was thinking this and praying about it, it says two things. It says something very powerful, that the document today is still calling for some of the same things we talked about 100 years ago. In one sense, that says we're being very true to our past and very true to our roots. And in the other sense, it says, darn, when will we ever learn? And I think there's kind of a sense of sadness I felt as I was reflecting on that these basic things are still some of the issues that we struggle with around the world. And I don't have a solution for you tonight. If I did, I would probably be running some country or something, but no. But I would not want to do that, so I wouldn't wish it on anybody. But we struggle with these elements and finding the answers. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of an overview into the church's documents and things, just to a sense of that. Now we're going to switch into Dorothy Day and talk about her life a little bit. And some of the things about Dorothy are, as I said, a little bit harsh. She lived a rough life in parts of it, and it could be easy to get stuck on one detail and to write her off entirely or something, instead of watching the amazing conversion story that she had, and to watch those details unfold. So I ask you to just keep an open mind and heart to anything. Now, Dorothy, she wrote her autobiography, The Long Loneliness, in 1952, when she was 55. And I read this when I was like 18 or 19, and it really made a lasting impression on me as a young woman, finding my way and figuring out my spirituality. And back in those days when I was a sponge and could remember everything and was excited by it all, and you know, that first zeal you wish you could recapture again. So she wrote that book at that time. Much earlier, she wrote her story From Union Square to Rome. And in that one, it's kind of a prequel. She was a younger woman, but she basically is explaining to her communist friends how she got from here, hanging with the socialists and her communist friends, to embracing Catholicism. And she's telling the story of her life, but kind of with a different reason and a different perspective. And I found them both very, very fascinating. I would, if were going to choose to read one book, I would read The Long Loneliness. And she has many other books. I have a whole bag of them down there. I took half of everything they had at the library at the seminary. And she has many books that have her writings from other journals and things condensed, or other resources throughout her life. And there have been 40 autobiographies written about her since then. I don't know 40, that's a made-up number, obviously, but there's just a lot of stuff on Dorothy you can find out there. So if this piques your interest at all, I invite you to do that. So as I said, she wrote her first book about her life when she was about 40. And she talks about her childhood. And she quotes Dostoevsky the Russian author, and she says, all my life I've been tormented by God. Not in a negative, like a evil sense, but always there was that calling, that niggling. And she struggled with that throughout her life, not always willing to embrace it. But it touched her, and it kept pulling her, it kept calling her home. And that was kind of a continual theme that you'll see over and over. And it's a little bit like fishing. I think I got the image, you know how when you throw a line out and you catch a fish and you bring it in a little bit and then it goes back out, and then you bring it in a little bit and back out before you can reel it all the way in. There's that kind of give and take taking place in her own life with God throughout her story. She doesn't use a fishing metaphor, but it just came to mind as I was talking now. But she writes about being a young girl. And then I remember we were in the attic. I was sitting behind a table, pretending I was the teacher, reading aloud from the Bible that I had found. Slowly, as I read, a new personality impressed itself on me. I was introduced to someone, and I knew almost immediately that it was discovering God. It was as though life were fuller, richer, more exciting in every way. Here was someone that I had never really known about before, and yet felt to be one whom I would never forget, that I would never get away from. What an amazing image as a young child to have that sense of awe and holiness. And you have to realize this is a girl whose mother had been baptized Episcopal but was not practicing. Her father was not practicing, so she grew up basically in an agnostic household. And this Bible changed her life at that time. She began reading as a little girl the Psalms, and they made a great impression on her as she prayed, "Enlarge thou my heart, O Lord, that thou may enter in." She also talked about going to see this friend of hers who was a Methodist girl, and she went to church with them, and she loved their hymns. Then her family moved on to California, and she got away from any religion, and back to Chicago again. They were following her dad's job. He was a sports writer, and not always a warm, fuzzy kind of fellow from what I think. She talked about going to visit her friend and the child not being there, but seeing the mother, Mrs. Barrett, with dishes washed, on her knees praying at like 10 a.m., that here was this poor lady just in her house praying. And she didn't know much about it at the time, but she saw it, she caught it, and she had this language of longing for beauty, and also longing for the rigorous. She would go over to the neighbors who had the family of 9 kids, and she would help babysit. She would wash the dishes. She would wash the floor. She would do things for them. She always had that sense of rigorous life, even as a very young girl. Now, in her teen years, she lived in a really sheltered environment. Her folks made sure there was no radio, that she was reading only good books, and she didn't really complain about that as much. It bothered her some, but she said, "My unhappiness always came from within myself. Looking back, I can see that it was not so much evil that I was protected from when the family kept us from shallow books, movies, newspapers, and other outside contacts, as it was that we were saved from the cluttered existence that people led. We were kept from the empty distractions that so many had to offer. We were more alone." I'm going to say that again. It was not so much evil I was protected from, but kept from the empty distractions. I kind of mused at this yesterday. I've been working on the presentation for a long time, but I'm sitting at my desk pulling the final pieces together, and Pandora plays a song on the radio, and all of a sudden I'm thinking, gee, I remember that on Lawrence Welk when I was a little girl. And so I'm off looking on YouTube for clips of this song with Norma Zimmer and how easily we're distracted today with all our gadgets and gimmicks, and I'm just high among the worst. But she said, because there was nothing to do, they were forced to meet their moods and to overcome them. And all throughout her life, I'm moving ahead just while I'm on the topic, she was a strong proponent for no radio in the car, for keeping silence at different times. Sometimes it bothered her too much, but realizing that there was that need to unclutter. And so she was always interested in that. When she was about 12, the Episcopal minister came around to the neighborhood and said to her mom, hey, I know you used to be on our records. Are your family more interested in becoming involved in church again? And Dorothy says, well, I am. So she began taking catechism classes and was baptized into the Episcopal Church. And she especially loved the Psalms and the singing. Her folks had another child, and this baby brother John was just the center of her universe. As she said, though, she was already in love with the hard life. Now, her father, being a newspaper man, worked strange hours, because the deadline was like in the middle of the night to get out the morning issues. And I think, as I said, was kind of a taskmaster, because in their family they were terrified of waking him once he was asleep. So she would be up till midnight studying or reading or doing something, and then up at 4 a.m. with this baby boy, keeping him quiet for Dad. But she took it on herself, and she recognizes that even as a kid, she wasn't mandated to do all this, but she took on some of it herself. And she continued to be a voracious reader. And something very fascinating, she says, as she's reading some of these writers, though, she went around to see poverty in the neighborhood, because her family was a little bit comfortable, not huge, but they were doing okay. And she said, I must have thought, coming from the agnostic household that I did, that religion was a private affair, that some people had faith and others didn't. And I really didn't think about it much. So she just kind of thought that was the way it was. You had it or you didn't, and it was okay. And not really any concept of a communal element of it at that time. She actually went away to college when she was 16, and she had some scholarships, and she got a small job writing. She was homesick for her little brother, and this is a period of time where things started to become anti-religious for her. She was living with a professor and helping care for their children, do the laundry and stuff. And he basically told her religion is for weak people. And okay, when somebody upper tells you stuff, you're going to believe them. And so she took that at first. But at all this time, she's reading and reading like crazy. Dostoevsky and Tolstoy made me cling to my faith in God, and yet I could not endure feeling so alone in it. I felt that my faith had nothing in common with the Christians around me. She wasn't good at attending classes, but she read her books. But she kept coming back to this nagging question. There was daycare available, but why didn't we just pay the father enough so that the mothers didn't need to work in the first place? There were hospitals, but what about occupations where there were diseases but not enough, caused by not enough food? So she kept kind of looking beyond, why are we putting a Band-Aid on this? Why aren't we looking at the roots of these problems? That would be a way you'd say that in contemporary. She asked that question over and over again. And she wrote in her diary about falling in love with the masses, meaning the masses of people, the ill, the infirmed, the farmer. And she started protesting for wages, and she joined the socialists. And she lived this life for that 2 years. She could have had jobs and lived a simpler life and just kind of conformed. She could have worked anywhere on campus, but she really didn't want that. That was not in her being and in her bones. So she went for 2 years there and then ran out of money, basically, so she moved to New York. There she worked for a socialist newspaper called The Call, and she took a room in one of the worst tenements she could find, particularly looking for something bad, something rough. Again, she always had that call for the rigorous in her life. And she describes this place as a 2-room flat, and the whole Jewish family she lived with lived in the one, and she lived in the other room and had a little single burner and paid $5 a month in rent out of their $10 rent. And there was one little light of window in the whole place. And that picture is not necessarily of that, it's just a typical tenement flat. She found out something very interesting as her views were swaying between socialism, the idea that the society should run the world for communal good, and anarchy, the idea of just rejecting all the status quo, everything that was. But she found something really interesting, that her paper was quoting Leo the 23rd. So the Catholic social teachings, she was hearing them and discovering them just kind of in a backwards, roundabout way. And remember, at that period of time, Catholics then were like a nation apart, a people within a people, making little impression on the tremendous non-Catholic population. So, I mean, in most circles, to be a Catholic was not a good thing. It was like just being another minority. And but she talked about working at that time. We worked from 12 noon till 12 night, covering meetings and strikes. We walked on picket lines. We investigated starvation and death in the slums. And at this point in time, she went to jail for her first time. She went to jail for picketing, and there were a whole bunch of people, and they were put in, a couple in a room, and there was a crazy person near her. And then she found that she was put in solitary, and she asked for a Bible. She was given the Bible, and she took great solace in the Psalms, in the lines, "Out of the depths I have cried to thee, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let my ears be attentive to the voice." She says, "All through these weary first days in jail, when I was in solitary confinement, the only thoughts that brought comfort to my soul were those lines in the Psalms that expressed the terror and misery of man, suddenly stricken and abandoned, solitude and hunger and weariness of spirit. These sharpened my perceptions so that I suffered not only my own sorrow, but the sorrow of those around me. I was no longer myself. I was man. I was no longer a young girl, part of a radical movement seeking justice for those oppressed. I was the oppressed. I was that drug addict, screaming and tossing in her cell, beating her head against the wall. I was that shoplifter who, for rebellion, was sentenced to solitary. I was that woman who had killed her children, who had murdered her lover. The blackness of hell was all about me. The sorrows of the world encompassed me. I was like the one gone into the pit. And she read this later, but how much this taught her about her own need again to help these people and her own recognition of the broader community. And she also, around this time, became familiar with the poem, The Hound of Heaven. And I think it's kind of funny because where she heard it was the playwright Eugene O'Neill read it to her at a bar one night. So she heard this at the saloon. So good things happen all sorts of places. And it's a beautiful poem. I did not put it in its entirety, but you can easily Google it, The Hound of Heaven. I think I put a link to it there as well. But she wrote the part she really liked. I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind. In the midst of tears, I hid from him. So she talked about that period of time where she was struggling, again, not knowing if she wanted to be with or away. That poem wakens the soul, recalls to it the fact that God is its destiny. And so she said, I need a change. I need something. That with the war, so many nurses were involved with the American Red Cross. So she went into nursing for a couple of years, worked in the wards, saw many, many terrible things there, again, helped people. She came back to Chicago, and she was still working, she was still writing. She was helping a drug-addicted friend one night, staying overnight with her, and they raided the hotel that they were at, thinking it was a house of ill repute, and so she was put in jail again, only with a different sentence this time. And she talks about how terribly they were treated, how people thinking they were prostitutes, just like how violent they were to them in jail, and just again the lack of human dignity that she experienced during that, and what she learned during that time. But she also, again, this niggling call haunting her to become Catholic came alive in another sense. She heard bells as she's walking down the street, and she walked into a church. And it was the first time that I had been present at benediction, and it made a profound impression on me. The very physical attitude of devotion of those who about me made me bow my head. But did I feel the presence there? I do not know. But I remember lines from The Imitation, that being the book, The Imitation of Christ, where it said, "Who, humbly approaching to the fountain of sweetness, does not carry then some little sweetness?" Or, "Who, standing by a copious fire, doth not derive therefrom some little heat?" So, saying, I may not understand everything that was going on, but I'm there. Just like being next to a fire, who's not going to gain something from that? She began to gain something, and she returned to that church over and over again. Around the same time, too, somebody gave her a rosary, and she kept it with her. She didn't know if she was praying it right, but she prayed it sometimes, and she found herself praying while she was walking. She found herself praying while she was working, that it just started to become more of her life, and conversing with God just became a natural part of her early mornings, a part of her day. And somewhere, I'm not sure exactly where in this time frame, she had been through a couple of relationships, and one of them had resulted in an abortion at this time. She had, in the circles that she was living and everything, there was not, she didn't think in a mentality of sins, really, because that was not in her background, not in her training. But she felt a terrible sense of loss from that, and a sense of shame later, and she thought, will I ever have a child? Will I ever be able to make up for that? She struggled with that loss. And during this time, she ended up moving out to Staten Island. She bought a little piece of land near the waterfront, and there she lived with a common law husband. And it was kind of a relatively peaceful time for her at first. Not much in the way of money, but the whole little village worked on the bartering system. Here's some bread, here's some fish, going back and forth, helping each other out as people needed tasks done. And it was just kind of a peaceful time for her. She also kind of watched more of her protester friends a little bit from a distance now, and kind of getting a sense of, this is where she's like really watching her communist friends and seeing that I don't like their ideals. I think they're wrong on this point, and this point, which it's another night, so I won't enumerate those. But she started saying, doesn't fit. This isn't who I want to be, in some senses. And during this time, her daughter was born, and she was very much in love with this baby, Tamar Teresa, and she wanted to have her baptized Catholic. But she knew that would be a very costful, is that right? Costly, thank you. I'm making up new words tonight. I can do that when I've spit out a few of them, right? Okay. That would be very costly because the baby's father would have nothing to do with her if she converted to Catholicism. He was an anarchist, and he wanted nothing to do with authority, nothing to do. So she struggled with that hound of heaven. She waited, it churned within her. At the same time, the murder or the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti took place. They were the Italian workers who were accused of a murder, and it was a very famous court case that went on for a long time. And many people think that some of the charges were trumped up because of the way they had protested the labor unions, that basically they'd torqued off the wrong people, and somebody was going to pay for it, and they were going to make a public statement out of someone, and it was Sacco and Vanzetti. And their death set her into a profound sadness and depression. But she said, it's beautiful what she says, so please permit me to read this to you. These men were Catholics inasmuch as they were Italians, Catholics by tradition, but they had rejected the church. But while enjoying the fresh breeze, the feel of salt water against the flesh, the keen delight of living, the knowledge that these men were soon to pass from this physical earth, were soon to become dust without consciousness, struck me like a physical blow. They were here now. In a few days they would be no more. All the nation mourned. All the nation, that is made up of the poor, the worker, the trade unionist, those who held most keenly the sense of solidarity, that very sense of solidarity which made me gradually understand the doctrine of the mystical body of Christ, whereby we are members of one another. She quotes St. Teresa, "Christ is disguised as bread, so that we will not fear to approach him. so that we can go to him in confidence daily, needing daily as we do our physical bread. We are not, most of us, capable of exalted emotion, save rarely. So we're not capable of exalted emotions. We are not capable always of feelings of love, awe, gratitude, and repentance. Sometimes we're just not there. So Christ has taken the form of bread that we may readily approach him, and feeding daily, assimilating Christ, so that it is not we, but Christ working in us. An example of Christ taking over where we are weak. I think that's a beautiful passage. So she makes the decision finally, yes, I'm going to be baptized. And that cuts many of her ties with some of her former friends, some of her co-workers, with her common law husband. It starts another period in her life. And during this Catholic life, she starts writing for a magazine called Commonweal, which is still published today. And it was one of the first magazines of Catholic social thought. And she also spent a great deal of her life working in various rooms and locations, taking jobs and projects and things that kept her near the church. So like she spent a summer working for a monastery, cooking for them, so she could be there and hear the sermons, hear the homilies. She became a Benedictine oblate about this time, following the rule of St. Benedict. She found much wisdom there as well. And Benedict's motto is ora et labora, which means work and pray. Seeing that the two pieces of life go hand in hand, she found great wisdom in that. But she always stayed close to the church, and yet still that hound was wanting more. She always had that sense of dissatisfaction that she wasn't doing something that she ought to be doing right. As she traveled, as she wrote for the Commonweal, she'd cover a story, and she still felt like, I need to be doing something more, and part of it has to be connected to my Catholic identity. So she comes home from one of these road trips, and there is a man named Peter Morin, basically sitting on her doorstep waiting for her. And he says, Dorothy, you know, you're doing a lot of good stuff. Your ideas are keen, you're kind of on track. But what you're missing is a lot of the basics of Catholic social teaching before your time. So you need to go back. You need to study the history of the church, the prophets, the church fathers, and even the documents of other faiths and religions where they talk about society. Basically, you need to have a strong foundation if you're going to be able to talk about these things well. So he formed much of her education and created a sort of sense of mission about her. And there were all sorts of little daily papers out and about. And they decided they wanted to write a paper, but it was something for the labor folks, for union people. It was something they thought, well, what shall we call it? Well, we don't want it just to be any rag. Again, there are a number of these out here like this. How are we going to make it stand apart? That it has these Catholic social values. And the newspaper from the Socialist Party was called The Worker. So they kind of took on that and called their paper The Catholic Worker. Again, saying, no, this is something different, something better. And they thought, how are we going to be able to do this? Oh, we can't do this. We don't have the money. But like the saints, their capital was raised by prayer. The worker started in 1933 with 2,500 copies. In 3 months, they had 25,000, and by 1936, they had 150,000 copies going out. That's in the age of simpler presses. That's a pretty good growth in a 3-year period. This Peter was a very simple man. He was well educated, but he was big into manual labor, and so he did every type of job there was. He worked on railroads, worked on farms and ranches, worked anything like that. And he didn't believe in wages, but worked in exchange for food and clothes and books. Books were huge. He ate books. He read them voraciously, even more so than Dorothy. A simple place to stay. And no matter how little money he had, he never refused to give alms. He believed that poverty and destitution were two different things. Destitution is to be totally bankrupt, morally, financially, physically. Poverty is to be living very simply, to be living without, but one can be happy in poverty. And he saw there being something different, and blessed are the poor. So he saw there were ways to do this. So first they started with a newspaper, and then speaking of this poverty, you got a bunch of people working together writing. It's a lot cheaper if we're living together. So they formed a house, and somebody's job was to cook, somebody's job was to... So they had their first Catholic worker house. Soon there were several houses. There were Catholic worker farms. It just grew. During this time, you'll see a picture on your sheets of a drawing. There was a young woman that came to be part of the movement, Aide Bethune, and she would take these sermons, these ideas of Peter's, and she could translate them to an art drawing. And people got a lot, a picture's worth 1,000 words, they say. So she could help people see and understand these things. And so the reader, the Hungarian factory worker, could look at this and maybe not read the words, but know what was going on by the pictures. And if that's, again, something kind of fascinating to Google, Catholic worker art, you'll see some beautiful imagery. They said that going around and seeing sights is not enough. To help people, to give what you have for relief, to pledge yourself to voluntary poverty, can care brothers is not enough. One must live with them, share with them suffering too, give up one's privacy and mental and spiritual comforts. Now, I'm almost done talking about Dorothy. We are watching the clock in your time here. The community continues to grow, and as with anything, when you get more people, you've got a lot of different ideas of what it should be like. And sometimes people came and they weren't happy, or this one lady said, here's $10,000, I want you to build a house. And they said, honey, you're not going to like it. You're not cut out for this life. And she says, oh, do it, do it. And then she got very upset with them when they were done and wanted all her money back. And so they had their definite hardships along the way. Another person came to them and said to Dorothy Day, oh, you're so holy, you must have visions of angels and saints around you all the time. And she says, oh, I have visions all right, visions of many bills needing paid. So she would just kind of call it like it was. During this time, a very dear friend of theirs had cancer, and she went to see him, and he said, there's so much work I wanted to do. And I told him physical work was hard, mental work was harder, and spiritual work was the hardest of all. and I pointed out that he was now doing the spiritual work of his life, lying there suffering, enduring, sowing all his own desires in order to reap them in heaven. He began to realize that he had to die in order to live, that the door would be opened, that there would be a glorious vista before him. And then she went on to talk about that he was given last rites, and how he kind of mumbled the answer as he was dying. And despite the lack of grace in the human sense, grace was there. Souls were strengthened and hearts were lifted. And she talks about that important need for ritual always. We felt a respect for poor and destitute as those nearest to God, those chosen by Christ for his compassion. Christ lived among them. The great mystery of the incarnation, which meant that God became man, that man might become God, was joy that made us want to kiss the earth in worship, because his feet once trod the same earth. It was a mystery that Catholics accepted. During this time, she did experience a lot of joy and sorrow. She, as a woman of about 38, someone just reamed her out saying, "Oh yeah, you write all this stuff, you can do all this stuff, but you're single and you don't have anybody to carry about, and you can have all these pie-in-the-sky ideals." And she said, "No, I have been single-handedly raising a daughter while I'm doing these works. I'm also mother to a growing community." And she struggled very much with, had she not done enough for her own child, in that she asked herself some of these questions. And she also struggled very much with her personal loneliness. She's got a beautiful portion in the book where she talks about, having lived as a married woman, now being in that celibate relationship that she was in, that was a struggle, and a struggle for many, many years, and that she missed someone on a pillow beside her. And she was very honest about that, and her humanity and her continued failings in the areas that she had to continue to work and grow. Her daughter was much like her, very independent, and she wanted to marry very young, so she was prepared for this by going to Canada to a monastery school there where they taught things like spinning and weaving and stuff, because she wanted to be in a farm life. And so it was basically an immersion course to help her get ready for the life she chose. And on her 18th birthday, they announced her banns of marriage, and she was married 3 weeks later. At that wedding, Peter Morin gave a speech, and it was his last speech. He basically had a stroke after and lost his illness and lost his memory and health. And she wrote how joy and sorrow, life and death are so interconnected, and the importance of that. She reminds folks you always need to sow what you reap, that you must give it away to receive. She talked about going to a retreat, and the priest said, "If you need $100 and you get $25, then give it away. Go do something with it. Give it away to someone else who needs it. Keep praying about it. The 100 you need will show up. That to sow it, to reap it." That was her idea. So they gave away whatever they needed. But again, you cannot love God unless you love others. And as she went on to live many, many years and do her life devoted to her causes still, and I want to read just a beautiful sentence, taking it back to the beginnings. "We were just sitting there talking, and people moved in and on us. Let those who can take it, take it. Some moved out, and that made room for more, and somehow the walls expanded. We were just sitting there talking, and someone said, 'Let's all go live on a farm.' It just happened." The most significant thing about the Catholic worker is poverty, some say. The most significant thing is community, others say. We are not alone anymore, but the final work is love. At times it has been, in the words of Father Zosima, a harsh and dreadful thing, and our very faith in love has been tried through fire. We cannot love God unless we love each other, and to love we must know each other. We must know Him in the breaking of the bread, and we know each other in the breaking of the bread, and we are not alone anymore. Heaven is a banquet, and life is a banquet too, even with a crust, where there is companionship. We have all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes with community. It all happened while we sat there talking, and it is still going on. I think that's just such a cool, something simple that she started and continues even though she's been gone since 1980. So, taking us to just back to that, at the crossroads where Christian life and conscience come into contact with the real world, we ask ourselves the question, how do we do that? How do we do that within our liturgy, within our lives? And it's a tall order to fill. And as I said before, there are those kind of 3 levels of involvement, and we're all going to have different ones, and at different times in our lives, in different situations. I don't expect you to be able to read that. This is on your sheets as well. But in the sacraments of initiation, baptism, Eucharist, and confirmation, we see some real clues. The document on baptism says, to bring us, the faithful of Christ, to His full stature, and to enable us to carry out the mission of the entire people of God in the church and in the world. To carry out the mission of the entire people of God in the church and in the world. And then the document on confirmation says, conformed more deeply to Christ, the newly confirmed are called to imitate Christ as they live in this world, taking up their cross and losing themselves for His sake and for the sake of the gospel. So what we do can't just have merit inside this church or wherever we may worship. It has to be something that we live, something that we take out of here. After that Eucharist, after that Christ we nourish, we need to take it with us out into the world. When we look at the liturgy itself, there are several elements within the liturgy. We can ask, how do we show hospitality to the person coming in the door, to the person sitting beside us? And we look at the whole liturgy itself. What do the actions call us to? That opening prayer is called a collect. And that's literally what it does, is it collects, it's supposed to take you in and collect your thoughts and bring them with everybody else's thoughts and bring them to that altar, bring them up there. So we come from our days and our busyness and our craziness and our lives and our fears and our concerns and our kids and husband we're mad at and our mother that we're worried about. We bring it all. We bring it all here. We collect those prayers. We collect the prayers for the world too. So often, those little opening prayers, that snippet goes by so fast, you don't see what was even there. So it's a challenge always to try and really listen, really hear those. Same way with the closing prayer asks, what is it calling us to do as we go out into the world? What is it saying, take away from this liturgy and go? It's like one final push out the door, that closing prayer. What do we hear in our scriptures? What do we hear? The psalm today was, the Lord hears the cry of the poor. Many times we're asked to enter into a mission. There's always an action. How does the homily lead us to action in our lives and in the lives of others? Hopefully we're hearing some of these things. My musical selections for the liturgy aren't just because it's got a good beat and you can dance to it, like the old Dick Clark, right? Does the music call us to justice, to peace, to mercy? How does it take us in that sense? I always say, no matter how powerful the readings were or how good the homily was, you're going to have more people leaving the church humming the final hymn than the homily. And so I've got an important job to try and give people something memorable to take out with them that focuses on some of these elements. And lastly, looking at, I just went past it, the Eucharist itself. It allows us to be transformed by God. We become Eucharistia. That means thankful. And we have to be empty and open in order to receive. The act of kenosis is what you hear in the Philippians hymn 4. Though he was in the form of God, he emptied himself, becoming a slave. You know that scripture passage, you've heard that, I think. Philippians 4, we hear it on Good Friday, we hear it through Holy Week. We have to be emptied like that so that there is room to accept Christ in the Eucharist and to take that with us. And that Eucharistic community is where we experience the reality and where we go out into the world. We ask ourselves, how did I keep being one ahead? Where are the symbols in our liturgy? Where are the rhythm and the silence and community? We have to ask, where is God? Symbols have many, many meanings. Now, a sign has just one. A stop sign means stop. But water, think of all the meanings water has. Water cleanses us. Water quenches us. It purifies us. Water may be terrifying in a storm. In Houston, water was a symbol, has many meanings. Meanings of fire, the other things. We pause to focus on what is going on, and we're present in the liturgy. We become oriented to God and to others. Augustine says, "Therefore, you yourselves are the body of Christ and his members. Then your mystery lies on the altar. Be what you see and receive what you are." So we're called to become that body of Christ, that koinonia. You know, in the Holy Habits Challenge that we're doing here in the parish, it's calling us back to many of these basic things. Turn off the TV while you eat, say your prayers before, after. It's calling us to these basic choices, these basic commitments. We need to have a rhythm that is not rushed or reinvented, because if we try and recreate the liturgy each week as making up something new instead of experiencing a ritual, we resist our transformation through God's self-giving. We don't form the body of Christ. I want to give you one last quote. Two last quotes. John Paul said in Ecclesia of the Eucharist, "Do you wish to honor the body of Christ? Do not ignore him when he is naked. Do not pay homage in the temple clad in silk, only then to neglect him outside when he is cold and ill-clad. He who said, 'This is my body,' is the same who said, 'You be hungry.' What God is it if the Eucharistic table is overloaded with gold chalices when your brother is dying of hunger? Start by satisfying his hunger, and then with what is left, you may adore the altar as well." So tonight we've looked at some of the social teachings of the church. We've looked at how Dorothy Day, as one example, tried to live them out, as probably one of the extreme examples. Our calls, our challenges may be very different than hers. And we've looked at how to put that together all within the liturgy. talked about it a little bit. I went off my last slide. In the Vatican II document, Gaudium et Spes, which I talked about earlier, the very first line of it, or an early line says, "The common good embraces the sum total of all these conditions of social life which enable individuals, family, and organization to achieve complete and effective fulfillment." And I pray that we find our fulfillment in the Word of God, we find our fulfillment in the Eucharist, and that we find fulfillment in our ministry as we reach out to help others in need and as we care for those in our families and in our world around us. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you very much. I hope this gives you a little picture. I'm 4 minutes ahead of time. Yay. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them, talk about anything. I appreciate your time and coming out very much.